Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interaction between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Child abuse is ugly, it's violent, and it's happening far too often in our community. The Children's Hospital at Brackenridge and Austin Metropolitan Ministries recently sponsored a symposium on child abuse, law, and grace. Two of the symposium speakers are our guests today on Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Barbara Holmes on the staff of St. John's United Methodist Church and your host on behalf of our religious interfaith organization, Austin Metropolitan Ministries. The entire community, including the religious community, is stepping up efforts to deal with this increasing problem. And our guests today have a word to bring us about many aspects of this problem. I'd like for you to meet the Reverend Sarah Bentley. We're identifying her as the director of Project Recovery, but there's several things we can say about Sarah. Ordained minister, glad to have you. Thank you for taking time. And Mr. Ronnie Earl, Travis County District Attorney, we're awfully happy to have you. I really appreciate both of you taking time out of a busy schedule and want to hear just a little bit about that conference, because I do think that it's unusual that the social working community, child care, the law, the religious community all get together to talk about child abuse. And I know that it probably was a very helpful event. But Sarah, since I think it would be helpful to know a little bit about your project, Project Recovery. What is that?
Well, Project Recovery is a program affiliated with New Life Institute, a counseling center here in town, and it's intended, and I created and designed it specifically to educate the religious community about family violence and to link people within the religious community to those kind of secular, quote-unquote, people working in agencies that you were talking about, to lawyers or district attorneys, and to try to create a kind of dialogue, as well as to find creative ways of meeting the needs of persons who are recovering from abuse.
Well, just a little bit about the conference, Ronnie, in that I'm sure there are probably other people in your office that could have represented your office in that conference, but you felt that you needed to personally be there and speak about these issues?
Yes, I did, Barbara, and I think the reason is implicit in your description of it, of different disciplines coming together, the law and the clergy and the medical community, and different disciplines coming together to discuss and deal with the issue of child abuse. I think it's time that our community teamed up on the issue of child abuse. The idea of people dealing with it separately in their different disciplines simply doesn't work, because it's too big a problem. And in fact, in my judgment, it is the single biggest issue that faces us from the standpoint of our own system of protection from crime. Because we've
Now, wait, let's talk about that a little bit. Say that again. It's the biggest threat.
It's the biggest issue that faces us as a community in terms of our system of protection from crime. Because we've learned that child abuse is the cradle of crime. Crime comes from child abuse.
The cycle.
Yes.
When you have domestic violence and battered spouses or elderly battering, sometimes those people were battered as children.
Sometimes there's a tendency to think that probably a majority of them are, and it's often the case. There are people who become abusive as adults who were not abused as children, and of course there are people who were abused as children who are able to overcome that. But more and more, not necessarily as a predictive statement, but as a descriptive one, we would say, yeah, that there is a cycle of violence. And one of the interesting things that's emerging in the religious community is more people being willing to come forth, or at least talk about in a pastoral setting or in a support group, the fact that they experienced abuse as a child. And these would be people who are adults in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and even 60s.
My first response to that is that I would see that would be difficult to do. There would be some resistance to that, would there not? Because we tend to think that the religious community, all of those good people, those kinds of things don't happen, you know, and somehow there's a shame, or you're not quite good enough if you've been a victim there. So has the religious community been a leader, or is it kind of having to be nudged along to take a leadership role in this child abuse issue?
I guess I'd say both. Every once in a while you'll find either a congregation or an individual, clergy or lay, who is a leader, is sort of a spark plug in terms of their own experience or their own dedication, or perhaps is in the position like Ronnie of being a district attorney and uses their work setting to, you know, increase the visibility of the issue. But in general, the religious community is viewed by those working in family violence as dragging their feet and even contributing by our attitudes to some of the problems, particularly in terms of the view of family relationship where parents get to dominate over children, where children don't have rights, and the theology of empowerment has been very, very slow to come to the churches, which is what we need in terms of dealing with abuse.
What do you mean, the theology of empowerment?
Well, the idea that people have God-given rights, like the right to be safe, the right to be taken care of, the right to be fed, the right not to be abused, but also that the ideal is for people of faith to become empowered, able to speak and act on their own behalf, able to protect the more vulnerable members of the community. And too often theology is looked upon as something that keeps people from claiming that kind of empowerment, or even helps them stay victimized. It makes them feel ashamed, or it sort of promotes keeping silence, which is the big problem in child abuse, is simply not being able to break through the denial that we all feel about this actually going on in the families of our community.
Well, aren't we experiencing a phenomenon now that we are hearing a great deal about it? Ronnie, are you finding the caseloads increased?
It's increased exponentially each year for the last 10 years anyway. It's been showing a steady increase, just it's going out the roof, and it shows no sign of ebbing at all.
Well, now, is that more child abuse? Is that more reporting, or is that more prosecution, or all of the above?
I think it's all of the above. I think it's all those factors in combination. But most of our child abuse cases involve sexual abuse. And most of our sexual abuse cases are incest cases, which comes as a great shock to people because of ordinary people can hardly imagine that. But it is a fairly common phenomenon.
So that if it is fairly common, then it is kind of ordinary people.
Well, that's right. That's right. It is ordinary people. You're exactly right.
You know, I would just take issue with, in the terms of incest, with the idea that there's more of it. I think there's now definitely more reporting, and in the case of Travis County, there's more proactive prosecuting. But from what we can tell from adults, there has been enormous amount of incest that went unspoken, you know, not just unreported, but unacknowledged.
Oh, as people are finding safe places to talk about it, you're learning that there has always been a high number. When you say cases, I need to clarify in my mind, what are crimes against children as opposed to, I know there's abuse, but what are prosecutable crimes?
Injury to a child is a prosecutable crime. Sexual assault of a child, that is a prosecutable crime. There are a number of crimes that are committed against children that are prosecutable. What we find is that there is a higher number of cases reported now than there was in the past. There is also, I believe, a higher incidence of certain kinds of abuse than there was in the past. Then finally, I think this is an issue of particular importance to the clergy and the religious community, is that we're beginning to redefine and define for the first time in many ways what is considered proper parenting. The idea of spare the rod and save the child is beginning to be, to get greater credence. And people are beginning to talk about that and practice that instead of the converse, which is the way many of us were raised. So I see that changing, and also a redefinition of roles within the family, as Sarah was alluding to, especially in terms of the power dynamics within a family. Because what child abuse really is a question of power. It's a crime of power. Like rape is not a crime of sex, it's a crime of power. And so those are areas, both in redefining the roles within a family and helping to understand what proper parenting is. Those two areas are fertile fields for the clergy to become involved in this issue too.
That really is very appropriate for the religious community, helping with parenting, the kinds of skills, the kind of relationships. Sarah, I was asking about crimes. Mm-hmm. Are there other kinds of abuse that are not prosecutable, but there's other ways to abuse children and abuse relationships?
Yeah, I would imagine that the most under-acknowledged form of abuse at the present time, in other words, that we haven't dialogued about sufficiently, is emotional abuse, which is very, sometimes it's difficult to pinpoint. There's the obvious form of emotional abuse is when you always call a child a name. In fact, now we have some public service announcements on TV about not talking to your child as if they're stupid. But there are other methods of abusing people by trivializing them, by making their lives seem unimportant, by minimizing things that happen to them, or by simply neglecting to respond to their emotional, spiritual, and intellectual needs. I mean, children are not adults, and this is only in the last century or so that we have begun to study enough to understand why is a child different than an adult, primarily because of their vulnerability and their emerging development. And everybody knows that from watching a 4-year-old throw a temper tantrum instead of being able to work out a creative solution. But we need so much more education in order to acknowledge the stage where a child is and what his or her needs would be at that stage, rather than imposing our values, particularly in some very, very strict religious upbringings. It's being reported more and more that children have very unrealistic expectations of what they can and cannot do, including keeping silent or sitting still for hours on end or always obeying, things that you can't ask an active 5-year-old to accomplish. And so what you do is you really suppress the child, and I don't mean that in a romantic way. I mean it really spiritually, that the child's spirit is systematically undercut till you can say effectively it's almost destroyed. And my concern, just to finish up about that for the religious community, is that we have not understood that as a spiritual issue, that children who are treated like that believe in a God who is like that. And it's very clear that children who are abused most often, not all the time, but cannot separate the kind of treatment they received at the hand of a parent from what they expect to receive at the hands of God. And this is just, I think, heretical, maybe too strong a word, but it's definitely abuse of the faith to create fear and pain in the lives of children, and then in a subtle way kind of rationalize that or support it by our religious overlay.
That's fascinating. The image a child would have of a supreme being would have to be based
Very
on
much
what
like
they
a
experience.
parent, right.
So I can see how that would really warp.
It's interesting because there are many survivors within the religious community, but there are many people who will no longer participate in religion because they do not choose, obviously, to believe in the kind of God that would allow or support or be part of that sort of punitive worldview. And it's very difficult to help someone recover a sense of balance and wholeness in their healing process without a spiritual dimension. So it's quite a task to really heal the violence, if you like, that was done to their image of God. And this is particularly true for me as a Christian minister, because what survivors or people who were abused as children tell me just simply does not resemble the God of the gospel. I mean, it is not that person or that image that we are receiving through the teachings of Jesus. So it's a tricky proposition.
Well, from the perspective that both of you have, let me just ask you, what do you see about some way to help people balance the necessary discipline for these vulnerable children, and yet at some point that can become abusive? You've spoken of the abuse of power, and yet you can't abdicate the responsibility that you have for seeing that a child doesn't run out in the street, or it seems to me that's parenting is just a very difficult thing in the best of circumstances. And how would be some ways that we could get at helping parent children responsibly, but that abuse of power, we are agreed that we have to have discipline in child rearing.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, discipline is, maybe Ronnie wants to get into it. Discipline isn't not in and of itself a negative or a punitive word.
Right.
It means leading, I mean, discipling a person. So what kind of way do you want to disciple them? Do you want to teach them respect and negotiation and dealing with people in different levels of power and responsibility in a humane way, or do you want to frighten them?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know what, let's hear what Ronnie says. The majority of child abuse, I don't think, is actually related to discipline. It's related to an adult who has low impulse control, who uses children, you know, as an outlet, because children are the safest people to use in our culture. I mean, you can't hit your boss, but you can beat your child.
That's right.
It's not about discipline, or if it is, it's about, as I said, totally unrealistic perceptions.
And many times the discipline, just because of sheer strength, is so disproportionate, using a switch, a ruler, a belt, or whatever.
There is a whole school of thought that is rapidly gaining some ascendance, that the use of physical violence against children is destructive to the child. Now, that is not the way we were raised. Many of us were raised where the belt and the switch and the paddle were resorted to quite often. But there's a school of thought that the kind of violence to which a child is subjected has a negative influence on the child's life, and that the kind of over-discipline we're talking about, I would agree wholeheartedly with Sarah. I wouldn't call that discipline, I would call that cruelty. And that happens from time to time, although less, I suspect, than it did formerly. We have always been taught that a child's spirit, rambunctious though it was given to us to discipline and to shape and to control and to mold the way to be like us. And we've given children basically not much freedom to be children. And I really think that, and there's some authority for this statement, that is at the root of many adult neuroses that people suffer from in our culture. God knows we got plenty of neurotic adults running around, and there is some considerable authority for the proposition that those issues that inhibit a person from living a full and complete life as an adult have their roots in the way they were treated as children. And often that treatment was out of a misplaced and mistaken desire to make the child into a little adult.
What Ronnie is talking about is emerging as a pretty well accepted view, especially in psychotherapy, but also in social work, that the family is in essence like an academy. I mean, it's where you first go to school, and right now it's too much of the time it's an academy of violence or of the misuse of power. It's not an academy of love, which the religious community would like to think of it, or even of respect. So that what we have to face is that we have to really look at what it is we are teaching our children. You cannot teach children as young persons that they are bad and in need of chastisement up until age 8 or 9 or 10, and then expect them to suddenly turn around and transform into these responsible, maturing individuals who can make good judgments and take charge of their lives. It's a contradiction in terms, and it's still difficult for many people to understand that.
We don't often find adult criminals who were not abused as children. The penitentiary is full of people who were severely physically and in many cases sexually abused as children. It has a deadening effect on the development of the psyche, and then, as Sarah said, of the spirit. And it's that we're going to have to address. Now, the law can do only so much to prosecute people who sexually and physically abuse their children and other people's children. We will require an enormous commitment of will on the part of the community to even do that. What we need is help from all aspects of the community, especially the community of faith in Austin, to help lead us to a higher plane of what it means to be a parent, what it means as a community to have children coming up. If we don't do it now, if we don't worry about it now, we're going to have to worry about it later, and it'll cost us a whole lot more to build prison cells later than it will to build faith and trust in the process of parenting today.
Well, it is a very large problem, but you all, is there some hope? Are we making some strides?
I think there's enormous hope. We, as a community, were so transformed by the death of Christopher Wohlers, which was kind of like an outcry against the whole community. It's like when a child is abused, they make outcry, then the law comes in and we do something about it. This was like, Christopher Wohlers was like an outcry of the community as a dysfunctional family, and the community has responded enormously. We've put together some cooperative projects. The agencies that officially are impacted by child abuse are working together and cooperating much more closely than they ever have before. They've been galvanized, as has the community, by this horrible tragedy. We're sort of on the cutting edge in a number of respects in this community in the area of child abuse, combating child abuse, and trying to reweave the fabric of community. It's that fabric that has been frayed over the years with changes in the structure of the family and the structure of the extended family. Uncle John and Aunt Mary don't live down the road anymore, and they can't help out. They've moved to California. And so we have to reweave that fabric and somehow replicate those functions that aunts and uncles used to perform. We have the beginning of some volunteer programs in this community. They're just getting started to give people the opportunity to be like volunteer aunts and uncles and help us put it back together again, because that's the solution.
The extended family, those networks, when people of the mobility, those support systems are gone.
That's right.
And Sarah, what would you add to that?
Well, I would just add that, ironically, and this may be hard for some viewers to perceive, there's more hope now because not only have we broken the silence, but we're willing to talk about child abuse as an issue of justice and to prosecute abusers, which some people may think is punitive, but it isn't. It's a way of saying we hold you accountable to be a member of this community. What you have done is not acceptable in our value system. And as long as we have discounted and minimized, the victim's pain goes unaddressed, and really the abuser's need goes unaddressed. The need to hear from the community where the limits are and to be helped if they're willing to seek treatment. So I see the emerging, in essence, strictness or sternness or toughness that we're all being more willing to take on with regard to prosecution and naming the crimes as a sign of hope.
That's exactly right. I'd like to enlarge on that if I could for just a moment. The whole idea of prosecution of child abuse, the basis of prosecuting the offender, is that each person has an intrinsic value and worth in and of themselves, and that you don't have to be powerful to be valuable. And the child is, by definition, not powerful. It's the abuser who's powerful, and to prosecute that abuser is an affirmation of the essential dignity and equality of the individual person.
I really liked what you said, that you don't have to be powerful to be valuable. And the value of a child sometimes is diminished just because of size and learning.
Well, and literally, you know, we were talking earlier, you and I, about the values, and one of the values that contributes not to abuse, not just of children, but of elders, of women, of all sorts of people, is the devaluing of persons who are vulnerable. And this culture is so power-oriented, not in the sense of empowerment, as we might like to think as people of faith, but of power over others, and that I win by dominating. And if we can't agree, we'll duke it out. And that the use of power to control other people's lives always devalues the person who is less vulnerable or has less access to resources in the community, financial or economic or social. And so implicitly you're in a one-down situation, and the value of the culture, instead of saying protect that person, says, you know, go for it. You can do whatever you want to them.
Right,
It's a very demeaning, unreligious view.
Yes, a society, the way that it takes care of its vulnerable ones, those helpless
Exactly
ones,
right.
is your judgment. And we have a long way to go in that. But I am encouraged hearing you all, and the time has flown by. We've got to conclude, but I would not want to close without expressing deep appreciation to each of you for being here. And now there is on your screen a list of resources and some phone numbers and places to turn for help. You need to write these down. You may need it later, because public awareness can be one of the most effective steps in responding to the problem of child abuse. Children should and need to know the safe places and persons to turn to. Stressed parents need to know there are programs and agencies to help. All of us can help provide these places of support and healing, and prayers for troubled family is something we can all offer. God bless the children. For Austin Faith Dialogue, good day.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.